deeper connections with their subject and reflect that in their practice. We are here sharing student projects featured in this track for the Lines of Sight exhibition.
Amrita, hi Dori. I think you would want to.
Yes. Amog, if you could go back to Dori's slide, I will just, yes, thank you. For this Points of View session, we have with us Dr. Dori Tunstall of OCAD University, a design anthropologist, researcher, academic leader, writer, and educator. Dori works at the intersections of critical theory, culture, and design. As part of the senior management team, she plays a vital role in steering aspects of academic and administrative agendas within the Faculty of Design, as well as related research, outreach, fundraising, and operational activities. Dori, the floor is now yours.
Good afternoon, good morning. We're actually in multiple things, so I'm going to share my screen so that I can begin. Share. So I like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and Hirnwindet, to the traditional owners and custodians of the lands in which I'm gathered here today in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, also referred to as Takaranto. And we do the land acknowledgement because it's really an important part of decolonizing our design curriculum and actually decolonizing Canadian society. I'm the Dean of Design at OCAD University. So OCAD University is the oldest and largest art design institution in Canada. Again, thank you for the wonderful introduction. I'm the first Black and Black female Dean of a faculty design anywhere. I'm a design anthropologist, so what that means is that I'm interested in the intersections of culture and design. And by heritage, I'm African American. And this becomes important because it means that my relationship to design and my relationship even to the fields of anthropology is one that is critical in many ways of some of the past practices. So I'm going to talk to you about decolonizing design as a way to talk about how, in some ways, we've not paid attention in some ways to the ways in which design can and has been harmful. But I also will talk about the ways in which, again, design can make amends for the harm that it caused. And then in the end, I'll show just some examples of our students' work as they begin to sort of take on this new understanding of what design is and what it can mean to them in a personal sense. So the ethos at OCAD University in the faculty design is respectful design. And what we mean by that is really trying to change the internal understanding of what we do when we make things. That we respect different ways of culture, different ways of being, that we respect all of our relations in terms of like the animal world, the plant world, the mineral world, all of these sort of things, because as designers, we have such strong impact in the world that if we don't approach the world with a sense of respect, then again, we have the potential of doing great harm in the world. And so I look at really closely what are the values, how those values are then translated into tangible experiences through the process of design, through the outcomes of design. And what we've been really looking at is that design, at least in the context of North America, has been disrespectful to Black, Indigenous, and POC communities and the land in and of itself. And so there's a lot of work that we have to do to change design, because in the context of where I'm living in Canada and the United States, many of my Black, Indigenous, and POC students feel like they have to choose between their beautiful and nuanced identities and being a professional designer. And that is because the values of design has been and still are in the context of North America, colonial, white supremacist, patriarchal, and capitalist. All of these processes which have been quite harmful to Indigenous, Black, and POC communities. And so I'm going to go through a little bit of like the context of living in Canada and the United States as it relates to it being a settler colonial state. And again, to talk about like that this is one of the areas of oversight where we haven't really paid as much attention as we could to the context in which design operates and the ways in which the context of how design operates can be harmful. So in the context of Canada and the United States, that there's a wonderful essay called Decolonization is a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and Y.K. Young that talks about that there's in Canada, places like Canada and the United States, but I would also say Australia, you kind of have like a triangulation of relationships in relationship to the land and in a relationship to sort of government policy. So in relationship to the land, you have the indigenous people who are the original owners and custodians of the land. You have settlers who have come from somewhere else to the land in order to impose new laws, new land use, impose themselves in many ways. And then you also have those who have been enslaved, so brought to the land in some ways to work the land as excess labor. In the context, again, of Canada and United States, the land has been stolen and pillaged. And then in terms of like government, that there's assimilationist policies that have been put in place that have been genocidal against anyone who has been non-European. And so that's the context in which design operates in North America. Which means that for many populations, again, design has been quite harmful. So in the context of, again, the indigenous peoples of North America, they are the original custodians of the land, and they have had to, in terms of assimilationist policies, actively fight for over 500 years against policies that have sought to, in direct quotes, like remove the Indian from the person, from the man, from the boy, to this was done originally through treaties, which were broken, and then through residential schools. So I don't know if you're following the news right now here in Canada, but now, actually tomorrow is Truth and Reconciliation, National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, in which the Canadian government is recognizing the harm that it did through set of residential schools in which 150,000 Indigenous children were taken away from their families and communities and put into these schools as basically labor camps, concentration camps. Actually, the model for Nazi Germany's concentration camps were actually based on these residential schools. And so what this means for design is that every other week, there's a controversy about some designer appropriating and misappropriating Indigenous motifs. So in this case, the image here is of K2Z, a British fashion label that had stolen the sacred design of a Canadian Inuit shaman named Allah. And in the article that's in Days Digital that I'm referring to, like the granddaughter of shaman Allah said all they had to do was actually to contact her to talk about it, and they could have collaborated on something together, to not just take an image off of Google Image and then reproduce that design in whole, because it is a sacred design, that he was a shaman, so the designs was in some ways their communications with the universe. So not only is it misappropriation in terms of, again, operating with a sense of an entitlement that you could take something from Indigenous peoples because it is felt that the practices of genocide were successful, that there weren't any Indigenous people that you needed to negotiate with or even potentially collaborate with. That assumption and entitlement allowed this company to feel that they could take something else, right, from Indigenous peoples without there being any implications or accountability for doing so. And so this kind of harm is the harm that, again, every other week there seems to be another controversy of Indigenous dress being stolen by a Western company. And again, this is part of the ways in which design is harmful, because that exists only in a context in which you feel that Indigenous people are not either around for you to negotiate with or collaborate with, or you don't have enough respect for them to feel that you need to enter in negotiations to be able to use their symbols. And again, when I have Indigenous students, we have to address the fact that, why would you want to enter into design when design as a field has been really harmful to your community? Again, there's also Black populations. And so in the context of North America, many of them have been brought involuntarily as enslaved Africans. The interesting thing is that, again, in terms of assimilationist policies, the system of white supremacy means that they're unassimilatable. And so if you think about the current context now of like Black Lives Matter, that Black lives have to matter, or that has to be a strong articulation of making Black Lives Matter, because the system in North America is set up in such a way to not recognize the sovereignty of the Black body, to not recognize the ways in which the medical system, the policing system, all of those systems are set up in place to be quite harmful to Black individuals and Black bodies. And so the example I always talk about how design fits within this is the cotton gin. So the cotton gin was developed by Eli Whitney around like 1794, I think. And it was one of those things that it was invented. He was graduated from Yale, needed to find a job, found a job on a plantation in South Carolina. In South Carolina, they have the cotton that they grow is short hair cotton, which means it is harder to remove the fiber from the seed. So he invented the cotton gin that basically what took a day for enslaved Africans to do could now be done in an hour. And again, he was really proud of this invention. He wrote home to his father saying, we're going to make so much money off of this. And it was devastating to the Black community, because in this process of making cotton production more effective and efficient, that in, let's say in 1790, there was 300,000 enslaved people, 700,000 enslaved people. By 1850, that number had grown to 3.2 million enslaved Africans. And almost all of this can be attributed to the efficiencies that was gained in the production of cotton, because as it became more efficient, more plantation owners wanted more land, again, taking more land from Indigenous people, needed more slaves. So at the time that this invention, slavery was actually beginning to wane because it was not as productive. But now slavery became really more productive. And at some certain time, it's like 3/4 of all the cotton in the world was being, or 3/4 of the exports of the United States was cotton that was being sent to all of the cotton mills in the UK, which then actually was part of what set off the Industrial Revolution. So again, very impactful, innovative design, but harmful in the sense of, again, leading to the enslavement, the further enslavement of 3.2 million Africans. And then in terms of dealing with people of color, and the term people of color it's not the best term, because it sort of puts together sort of those who are of Asian heritage, those who are of Latinx heritage, those who are of Middle Eastern heritage. So in some ways it's not a perfect term, but what it seeks to do is to recognize that there are some differences in how Indigenous people, Black people, and these other populations, at least in North America, are situated in the settler colonial state. So in terms of their relationship to land, often they've had to escape home to become new settlers to the land. So coming to Canada, coming to the United States. And in some ways, they've had the privileges to choose or make very difficult decisions around which aspects of their identities that they want to leave behind or need to leave behind in order to assimilate. And this has to do with how much wealth they have when they immigrated, what's their class status, what's their education status, and in many ways, what's the color of their skin. But even within the ability to sort of buffer between not having to be Black and not being quite assimilated into whiteness, that they actually experience extreme discrimination and prejudice. And so this is an ad for again, washing powder in the 1886 that was celebrating the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which again prohibited Chinese immigrants from coming to the United States. I think it was in 1884. And then Canada also passed a Chinese Exclusion Act at this just a few years later. And again, like this is soap powder selling discrimination, selling stereotyping in ways that, again, as I'm trying to explain to my Asian students, like why you should be invested in design as a process, we actually have to, again, address this harm that design has done. And so I think it's really important when we talk about decolonization in the context of the work that we're doing, that we are talking about Indigenous land sovereignty, that it's tied to those relationships to land. But in terms of design, it means we actually have to liberate design from the modernist project. And what we mean by that is that there's a story that we tell about design as something that happened in the 1800s in Europe, right? Actually tied to the Industrial Revolution. And through this, that there's two kind of mythologies, this ideal of progress in which technology can bring luxury to the masses. And there's also this notion of universal humankind or universal mankind, that if you drop your national or ethnic baggage, then you can belong to this and we can live harmoniously. And in the context of Europe in the 1800s, these are quite revolutionary ideas, right? That the ideal that the peasantry in some ways can have a good life at the same level of the aristocracy or just lower than the aristocracy, that's a quite revolutionary idea. In the context of the consistent and long wars between European nations, the ideal of, you know, leave your German blackface behind, or leave your Italianate calligraphy behind, and, you know, march to the tomb, the universal tomb of Futura or some other sans serif font. Like, this is really compelling and utopian, again, in the context of Europe. But when you bring that same idea, in some ways, you bring that same ideal to India, but definitely when you bring that ideal to places like Canada and the United States, it becomes colonization 2.0, where the ideal of providing through technology progress for the masses is based on things being cheaper because you're exploited in the labor of enslaved peoples or indentured peoples, that you have stolen the land, right? Taking the land for nothing or very cheap from indigenous peoples. And so being able to provide to the masses means that you're actually harming great masses in this project. And then the notion of drop your national and ethnic baggage, that becomes cultural genocide, of which, again, I've talked about, especially in the case for indigenous communities. But again, understanding the way in which design has contributed to colonization means that we can begin to make amends and address design and make it do a different thing. And so I'm going to talk now about like some steps that we've taken at OCAD University to bring diversity, equity, and decolonization to design. So one of the things that we've done is that we've put Indigenous demands first. And we've achieved this. So in our academic plan, the first principle is decolonization. And what we've done now, we've just completed, starting this fall, is our second cohort of Indigenous faculty. So in the past 5 years, in the faculty design, we've gone from 0 to 7 Indigenous faculty. And they've been able to transform our curriculum. We have working with Nadia McLaren, who's our coordinator for Indigenous relations. We've developed Indigenous learning outcomes to put into our curriculum. We've engaged with the medicine wheel as a way to help us understand our process of relationship building and transformation. And we've been changing the way in which we think about design in and of itself. So there's a picture here of like a buffalo with the word respect. And this refers to the work of Howard Monroe, who's a Métis, one of our Métis faculty. And what he's done is he's taken the 7 grandfather teachings, the 7 grandfather principles, and realigned the design process to those teachings. And so when we talk about analyze and research process and design, we also talk about it in terms of the teaching of respect, and how in respect, you have to know your relationship to that which is also has knowledge in the world, and respect to that knowledge in the world. And so when we go to do interviews or observations, what we're doing is we're practicing respect. We're learning the limitations of what it is that we know, and opening ourselves to the knowledge and the wisdom of others, right? By respecting what it is that they know. This has allowed us in many ways to own up to the institution's racism and white supremacy. So we had a presidential task force on underrepresentation, and we've had long conversations about, again, how do we increase the number of diverse faculty who represents those who've been underrepresented historically in our institution. How do we talk about like whiteness without white supremacy? So again, even though that's changing, I think at this time, 80% of my faculty were white. Now it's hovering around only 50% are white. But we had to address, again, what do we understand about whiteness as an identity? And can it be without white supremacy culture? Can we change the values? Instead of looking at perfectionism, can we look at appreciation? Instead of like focusing on individualism, can we focus on teamwork? We've had to establish authentic relationships to Black, Indigenous, and POC communities. And so this is me pre-COVID, being part and attending almost any event that I could that was really considered important to the Black community. This is having workshops with Black youth, to attending networking events that happen on a weekly basis, to, again, being in the shops and stores and promoting Indigenous business, Black and Indigenous businesses. But again, entering into real partnership, entering into real consultation with communities so that they feel in many ways entitled to the resources of the institution in and of itself. And I always say, like, my key performance indicator that I was being successful is that I had attended one event and someone had said, OCAD University is in the house. So they didn't say me, Dori, as an individual, they said me representing an institution was in the house, that they consider OCAD as part of the community. And that is because we've built an authentic relationship. And what we've been doing again is re-understanding the way in which we reach out to communities and community interests, and not just our own interests. And this is through hiring. So for our Black cluster hire, we did 3 things that were really important in the call. We talked about people's lived experiences and how important it was in relationship to their work with specific communities. And then we said, what we're looking for is not like an interaction designer. We're not looking for a strategic designer. We're looking at things, people who can bring things that are of interest to the community, like Black speculative futures or representation of Black lives or hip hop aesthetics, and bring those into the institution as valuable. And we've done the same for our Indigenous cluster hire. So again, even not talking about sustainability, but talking about water and land protection, to talk about visual sovereignty and self-representation. So again, what are the things that are of interest to the communities we're seeking to embrace? and identifying how important those things are to our institution. And then we've actually redefined our standards of quality, qualifications to take into account systemic exclusion. So when we call for faculty, we normally are looking for a traditional academic, which means they've already had to been in the post-secondary sector for 2 or 3, if not more years. But again, there are communities, Black communities, Indigenous communities, and certain POC communities that have been systemically excluded from post-secondary systems. And so we identified that, well, actually, their success that they have, sometimes they do it in terms of practice. So they're a praxis star, or they're doing work within community. And in that, they have equivalent skills that we want in the university as someone who is a traditional academic. So we need to redefine our qualifications so that we can embrace those who've been excluded from the institution, post-secondary institutions, to be truly inclusive. And we're hiring for critical mass. And so again, this is the result of the Black cluster hire, where we brought in 5 new Black faculty, doubling the number of Black faculty at OCAD University within 1 year. And what's everyone talks about in this moment was like how many different accents that we had, how many different cultural backgrounds, how much diversity, and the fact that everyone felt comfortable speaking in their accents, because most of the time when you're trying to feel like you assimilate in an institution, then you hide your accent. And yet here, everyone was speaking in their beautiful patois. And so what does this change mean for the work of students? And I'm just gonna talk about 2. So this is a project called Design With that was run by one of our faculty members, Ronnie Lee. Ronnie Lee is of a Chinese background, but grew up in the Philippines. And this is a response to COVID-19. So the students developed kind of soft, this is an industrial design class. So it was a soft goods course, and they developed kind of the responses to COVID-19 and to the things that are going on in terms of Black Lives Matter. So this is a sort of a soft design that was done out of materials. Again, in response to the murder of George Floyd. And again, the designer of this is Tyler Williams. And again, how do we create space, right, in the context of design that's been harmful, in this case to Black communities, to turn design into something that allows us to respond to that, to shift the purpose of design so that it aligns with the way in which we want to make in the world. And so through this project, Tyler was able to, again, change that narrative, change that understanding of what design is and what it means to him. This is a great project by Adele Bachera, which just won the RGD Awards around localizing brands. So basically what he did is he investigated and developed a custom typeface for the Arabic language, and he's of Lebanese. This was supported by a faculty member, Isabel Morales. And again, it's a thing where if design has been harmful in the sense of sort of discriminating against POC people, in this project, Adele takes global brand like Google and redesigns it so that it actually speaks to his community, that it's responsive to his community, as a way, again, to sort of shift the understanding of what design is and what it could bring. And I won't play the whole thing, but I'll play just a little bit.
Hello, my name is Adil, and welcome to Localizing Brands. After extensive research about the role that Arabic graphic design plays in the Lebanese culture, I applied the knowledge I've learned by localizing brands culturally. The goal of the project is to create designs that invite some people to embrace and connect with their cultural heritage through common services. I am presenting my concept by localizing a brand that we all use or come across with on a daily basis, no matter our age or culture: Google. My first step was to observe how Lebanese people use Google services, in particular the available Arabic versions of them. This helped me identify the issues Google Arabic designs have, which gave me an opportunity to reconfigure some of their platforms. This is an analysis I did on the Arabic version of Google Search. The main issues that needed to be solved were the eye movement, since Arabic and English are written in two opposite directions, as well as the typeface choice. I started out by designing an Arabic version of their logos, as well as an animation showing the transition from the English version to the Arabic one. And I also reconfigured the logo of the different services they provide. I couldn't find an Arabic typeface that matched the Google logo I made, so I designed a fully functioning modern Arabic typeface that matches Google's identity and goes well with their Latin typeface product zone. I use this typeface for all of my Arabic content. So now that I had the logos and typeface, I redesigned some of their web pages in Arabic, including Google Search Result, Google Chrome, and Google Translate. This was a turning point in my process. Google is a brand that offers easy solution to everyday problems through their services, and I wanted to have one made for Lebanon, Google Fusha. Google Fusha is a service I came up with.
That shows you that. So again, what are some of the things that we're doing to decolonize design? We're putting Indigenous demands first. We've owned up to institutional racism or white supremacy. We've made authentic relationships to Black, Indigenous, and POC communities. We've brought in Black, Indigenous, and POC faculty members by speaking about their interests and not just the interests of the institutions. We've redefined our qualification standards to take into account systemic exclusion. And again, that we're trying to reach critical mass so that the diversity and inclusion of our faculty reshapes our understanding of the story of design and what design is and what it could be, so that our students feel empowered and emboldened to make sure that design services their communities and services their diverse needs. So with that, I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Dori. That was an incredibly generous speak into your practice and thought process. We're all personally big fans of your work. I will now proceed to presenting the student work from today's panel. Right. The other LP by Meher Jangra is a classroom project. He creates a kinetic sculpture that was based on the philosophy of othering. The final form is a record player, a see-through acrylic cube with electronics that control the motion of the record player arm coated in molten lipstick.
The other LP is an auditory kinetic sculpture which took form as a classroom project based on the philosophy of othering. Othering basically is an umbrella subject of study for societal evils like racism, homophobia, or Islamophobia, and how these things operate. So for inspiration, I began studying motions and movements in society that either subject people to or are examples of othering. Growing up as a queer person, I've had been subjected to the underprivilege that people of non-normative gender and sexualities hold in public environments or social environments, and how even body language is othered. Another great example was of migration, a large-scale movement stemming from the very reason of privilege or lack thereof. So I realized how othering existed in the most fundamental functioning of society, and whatever be the markers of social differentiation that shaped the meaning of us and them. There is always the danger that they will become the basis for self-affirmation that depends on the denigration of the other group. For example, this wheel of privilege in a way shows you how likely you are to be othered in society depending on where you fall on it, be it your language, your formal education, citizenship, or skin color. So traveling inward from the outskirts on this wheel is difficult and takes lifetimes for some people. Extending this metaphor to a tangible object, I deemed the record player an interesting vehicle to voice this concept and design the other LP, in which the vinyl was representative of the wheel of privilege, and its sonic arm held a ball of lipstick traversing inward on a vinyl made out of sandpaper. The lipstick was almost completely consumed by the time it reached the center, commenting on how othering also works. Ultimately, this project roughly sat somewhere on the left side of this unresolved, long debated axis, but in retrospect, I realized that ingrained in these very progressive design practices I liked lie several glaring questions that are overlooked. The cornerstone of, for example, critical design and speculative design is the exciting leap that we take from asking how else to asking what if. But the lens through which these questions are asked are also of importance. Ahmad Ansari, in a debate on the politics of design, puts forward some important questions which ask whether these practices can be more inclusive in the way they are put to use, even if treading on fictional and probable futures. Because a terrible oversight would be for these practices to turn into academic buzzwords, which only become devices used by the privileged in the name of exclusive intellect. Which makes me question, are critical and speculative design unconscious post colonial tools of othering? The other
Next up, we have Trees and Toes, which is a classroom project by Supriya Patil, Anshika, Chaurasia, and Induja Menon. It proposes a service that allows people to reconnect with nature through an adventure designed around series of nature-based activities. It explores how sensitivity and creativity can blossom best when we give ourselves time to be in nature.
Nature is all around us, and yet, with our crazy hectic lives, we have managed to cut ourselves from it. Team Trees and Toes identified this gap and curated a nature journey for the students, staff, faculties, and the visitors of the NIT Gandhinagar campus. Often, we forget to pay heed to all that nature offers us, but that's where sensitivity and creativity blossom the best. In the middle of the unexplored corner of the campus stood a tall, humble space curated to allow people to experience solitude and be in sync with the serenity of nature. A quiet moment to indulge in the beauty of nature solely served as a pause, a moment of reflection and appreciation. Moving forward in the journey, we let the users collect tidbits of nature along the trail to the DIY section. We look, but we don't see. We hear, but we don't listen. There are some experiences that we don't even live. Our blind sensory game allowed the users to acquaint themselves with the details of the nature through the sensorial responses. With senses now more awakened and aware, we carried the fun forward to our do-it-yourself or the DIY station. Here, we let the users put their creative minds at work for creating nature-based crafts. The next set of the journey was decided based on the user's preference of being a wanderer or an explorer. The explorers set out to play Nature Bingo, a fun-filled game that took them to different parts of the campus. They discovered different elements of nature, from twigs to leaves to the birds. A setup was laid out in the midst of the lush green meadows for the wanderers, who preferred quiet, undisturbed time. This enabled them to take in the subtle moments hidden in the immediate natural vicinity. The means of getting closer to the nature were now open.
Move. Um, I think we have, yeah.
A curiosity to know and be more in nature more often. Daily routines, switching between classes and work, laundry, a quick bite at Kopcha, with conversation sprinkled here and there. It is easy for us to take the little details around us for granted. Sometimes, all we need is a quiet moment, a moment to observe, enjoy, and be engulfed in the beauty that nature is. We at Trees and Toes try to serve you just that. 6 days, 32 nature journeys, and 32 people now closer to nature.
Up next, we have the project title, Why the Tides Ebb and Flow, which is Nalini Balakumar's graduation project, where she navigates through personal and intergenerational trauma by looking at her matrilineal history. Her aim is to create a space to heal together.
Hello, I'm Nalini Balakumar, a recent graduate of MDes in Photography Design. I'm delighted to be part of Lines of Sight and to share my work, Why the Tides Ebb and Flow. In this project, along with my mother, I try to find ways to address and heal from my personal and transgenerational trauma in context of my Dalit Christian inheritance. Even though photography has been my primary medium, I also wanted to work with knitting and embroidery. As Rosika Parker puts it, to know the history of embroidery is to know the history of women. She says that embroidery has been a means of educating women into the feminine, but it also has provided a weapon of resistance to the constraints of femininity. These skills are one of the most important heirlooms that my grandmother left us. It was only right to explore memory and to unburden ourselves of misogyny and casteism inflicted on us through the very same medium. As women who practice flenews, my mother and I try and reassert our identities by going to public spaces and practice knitting in a city that has continually marginalized us. Through a series of intermedia practices that uses photographs, audio, textile, and psychogeographical cartography, that is creating maps by locating trauma through psychosocial as well as physical geographies. This project is an attempt to navigate through the history of our shared matrilineage and to recognize and honor the lives of women in our family.
Up next, we have Dandakaranya, which is a fiction film made as part of Souvik Chowdhry's graduation project. The film is inspired by the culture of valuing land and resilience practiced by indigenous tribes for a hill earmarked by the government for excavation. The film is an experiment with form, craft, and storytelling.
Hi, I'm Souvik from the Film and Video department at NIT. I like to travel and explore different cultural diversities of varied tribes and races distributed all across India. When I read the book The Burning Forest by Nandini Sundar, I came to know of the tremendous human rights violations carried out by the government towards the indigenous tribes of Bastar in their attempt to hunt down the Maoist extremists that infest the forests of these regions. They trained sometimes underage tribals with guns for 2 months and used them to coax and threat the interior villagers to come and live in camps in the cities called Salvajudum. After news of unreported murders, rape, and plunder broke into the mainstream media, the camps were rendered illegal, though still a similar method under a different name is being used to tackle the Maoist problem. Bastar is rich in mineral resources and so is an important mining site for the government. To research, I with my friend Bharat and Binoy traveled to Bastar, specifically the Kirandul village in Baladila range, where a protest was happening against the private mining group Adani because a new mining site had been declared in their sacred mountain.
आज की जो ये गैदरिंग है पूरे साउथ बस्तर में बल्लाडिला के पहाड़ को लेकर के जो मेन मुद्दा जो यहाँ पर इतने तादाद पे लोग आए हैं 4 दिन से धरना प्रदर्शन कर रहे हैं, बात ये है कि यहाँ पे जो माइंस हैं आयरन ओर है, लोहे की खदान है, काफ़ी बड़ा लंबा पहाड़ियाँ हैं और काफ़ी ह्यूज डिपॉजिट है। इस वजह से एनएमडीसी जो भारत सरकार की ये है उपक्रम है वो यहाँ 1960 से ऑपरेशन कर रही है। एक डिपॉजिट है नंबर 13 जिसमें नंदीराज पहाड़ के नाम से है, जिसमें देवी देवता हैं, हमारे इष्ट देवते हैं ट्राइबलों के, और उसकी चिंता सबसे ज़्यादा है। इस बार चूँकि वो देवी देवताओं से संबंध है, इसलिए इतने लोग बिना लीडरशिप के इतना बड़ा आंदोलन ये कर रहे हैं, तो कहीं ना कहीं कोई मायने रखता है।
This inspired my fiction short film story where the protagonist Linga had lost his father during the Salvajudum era. Since then, an activist took him under her wings and provided him with an urban education. While making the film, after talking to the natives from different backgrounds, I found one constant among the youth. School dropout rate is high because kids cannot identify with the foreign mode of education. The government policies for indigenous tribes are always like damage control, aimed at exploiting the earth more. For a complete development, we need to focus on good healthcare and restructure the education system, taking inspiration from policies which have borne results for natives in Latin America or African countries.
Up next, we have Racism and Colorism, which is a classroom project by Vaishnavi. This politically themed print was a response to the frustrations and anger at hate crimes during the pandemic. She attempts to make conversations about systemic racism happening on social media more accessible in the real world.
Racism and Colorism is a politically themed print which was a result of frustration and anger from recent hate crimes during the pandemic and multiple failures of the society at large. Unfortunately, this issue, along with many other social issues, gets massive attention when an incident occurs and with time gets forgotten. But the issue continues to exist in subtle forms of language, behaviors, choices, and actions which become normalized in society and we fail to see them as problematic. There are multiple dialogues on this on social media, but unfortunately, that medium exposure is still a privilege not many have. The main idea was to use textile as a platform to take this conversation to a larger audience. Since we are surrounded by this medium, the impact could be potentially huge, which means it could function as a talking point for many and hopefully lead to people asking more questions about it. But while the approach was focused on the reach, there was a gap in understanding that the research and execution had to be just as carefully planned for that kind of an audience. I learned to take continuous feedback after this project because it was when the work was almost 95% done, it was observed that there was lack of inclusion of opinions and perspectives of the people who were more likely to be affected by the issue. I had to go back and consult more people, reconsider the choice of elements, and question the execution. What purpose did they serve? Did they do justice to the topic? And were they being received the way they were intended to? I had to question my own intentions for making the print in the first place. Was it a savior complex or was there a more personal reason for it? It led to deep introspection on my own experiences. It often happens that we as designers intend to do good but fall short on execution and instead it does more harm than good. But as they say, it's never too late. We can always fix our mistakes. One just has to acknowledge and reflect on where they went wrong.
what they overlooked, accepted, and tried to be more inclusive, tried to be better. It is difficult to take criticism, especially when you think you were doing the right thing all along. But there are multiple levels to understand and perspectives to look at when working on social political issues. What you want to do and what needs to be done can often be different and also sometimes hard to accept. This project, in a way, helps me ask more relevant questions, which often help me check myself during a process. Where is it that I'm crossing a line? What is my motive to pursue this? Why and for whom am I doing this? Am I able to detach myself and see it from the other side? Some questions that help me understand and empathize a little better.
Our last project in this lineup is designing a feminist Devanagari typeface by Srishti Mitra, which is her classroom project about designing Devanagari typefaces inspired by UN Sustainable Development Goal number 5 on gender equality. She aimed to create a typeface that combined the more perpetually feminine aspects with boldness and strength.
Hey, I'm Srishti Mitra, and I'll be talking about my feminist Devanagari typeface named Rani. These are what the letter forms look like. It started off with Sustainable Development Goal number 5, which is gender equality, and I wanted to combine it with typeface design. So I tried to see whether different physical characteristics of typefaces could be seen as gendered. And to see whether Devanagari typography, which consisted of very complex letter forms, could also be seen as gendered, I created a survey and sent it out to a lot of different people from different backgrounds. And in the survey, it asked whether the typeface was seen as feminine or masculine. And this is an overview of the results. You can see that most of the typefaces lean pretty heavily towards either end of the spectrum, which is how I could categorize the typefaces into two genders. And breaking down the typefaces into their component facets, I also got a list of what facet can be associated with femininity and masculinity and which ones tend to be more neutral. And I tried out different combinations of these facets to create a typeface of my own until I settled upon this one. If we look at the letter forms closely, this combines the feminine facet of a concave stem and high contrast letter forms with strength, which is shown by squarish geometric structures, and the boldness of the typeface. This is the typeface in use. One thing I wish I had done differently in this project is to take the data of the respondents of the survey themselves. So, for example, I would have loved to see whether the age or the gender or whether they're familiar with Devanagari would affect how they would have seen the typefaces through the lens of gender. Thank you.
And with that, the floor is now open for a roundtable discussion between today's speakers. We welcome again our guest Dori to speak on the theme of oversight, and Sucharita Beniwal as a faculty interlocutor for the roundtable to share their thoughts, observations, and questions along with the student presenters.
Thank you, Dori, and all the student presenters. I think they've come in very slowly. So, Dori, your talk was really provocative, and I liked how a lot of our students responded with similar kind of work. Like I could see Srishti's work talk to adults, Vaishnavi's work talking literally to tilers, and the othering that Nair talks about it as a post-colonial tool, as well as Souvik's point of indigeneity and identity working. So I would like Souvik to respond to that part of, or Dori, you to respond to Souvik's part of how he brought in the Bastar identity and the identity that is celebrated in the work that, in spite of being another kind of colony, America and Canada is being able to look at, and which in India is still a baggage that one has to deal with.
Okay, shall I go first? I mean, I think what for me was the thread that I was hoping that would connect between sort of the work is the sense of that there's still sort of colonial legacies that are continuing in India, even though the configuration, let's say the triangulation, is different, right? There's still the legacies, but also in some ways, though, that what we're all talking about is like, what are systems of oppression and what are systems of exclusion, and how is it related to, again, the relationships we have to the land and the way in which our identities are made manifest or inhibited because of like our relationship to place, our relationship to land, our relationship to our genders and things like that. And so, so for me, what again, I wanted to speak to a specific North American context, but I think the thematics are very similar in the sense of like, we all as designers, right, have to figure out how do we make sure that the skills that we have, the tools that we've developed are actually really used to not contribute to the greater vulnerability of the land, to not contribute to the greater vulnerability of specific communities, and actually really use our tools and our knowledge and our skills on behalf of communities to give them sort of agency and power in some ways to self-define and self-determine themselves. And so again, it was lovely to see that in the work, right? Of all of your work are really trying to wrestle with that and wrestle with that in terms of what it means to be a designer.
I wanted to talk about a bit why religion is a very important factor. If I just think about India, one of the party in power now, BJP, came into prominence mostly with the Ayodhya topic, where Ram temple being constructed. So that's because Hindus are majority in India, that became a national phenomena and a huge following gathered. And when I went there to research, and I found that how spontaneously this thing has made the indigenous people also come together without any leadership, just by their own. They walked for 10-20 kilometers just to reach there. They are staying there with they're cooking there, and somebody has arranged some water for them to bathe and stuff. So, and it was very interesting to me, this religion being a binder for all communities and their faith. And when somebody disturbs that, tries to topple that over, how that kind of makes people come together for a cause, kind of. So when that was the thing that interested me on that year, especially with the Ayodhya conflict. And now this doesn't come in the mainstream media much because not the majority cares about the concerns of the indigenous people, because the representation in the mainstream is very less. So I realized during the course of the project, we need representation in all levels, in government, in parliament, from indigenous tribes, and to truly when representation is slowly increasing, it will gradually kind of uplift the people by itself. So And to do that, like when I was talking to the youth there, like it was important, like they could not identify with the kids. The high dropout rate is because kids could not identify with the foreign kind of mode of education. So at least in the initial primary school level, people like kids need to express in a language, in some language when they are studying. So if their like mother tongue can somehow be implemented in the course structure, and that can be accepted at least in the initial level. Some similar studies are being going on. Like I was reading some paper in Tanzania and places in like South Africa, even in Latin America. So some similar education policies, if where it will bring a very gradual but a solid change, where the people are truly uplifted, kind of.
Nick, if I was to look at how Meher used that aspect and what Dori was questioning, how you're constantly trying to choose from your own identity and the identity that you have to subscribe to as a designer, and how Meher brought in an artifact to question that. And while, yes, at policy level, you can see, say, at least in OCAD, 10 different kinds of faculty on that screen with is coming through. I would want Meher to talk about this fact that how he negotiated this thing of being a designer and a maker, and then using it as a provocation to mediate his identity and the conflict of it.
Thanks for the question, Sucharita. So it started as something very blurry in between the lines of art and design, right? But with the topic of othering, to kind of construct this narrative of how things roll out, I realized that it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, wherever it falls, right? It's being critical of something that design does, or things, the things happen in society, right? So irrespective of the fact that how these things, I'm sorry, I'm really kind of losing the track of question. Could you repeat it?
I was just appreciating the fact that you were able to mediate your making, the aspect that
Right.
the Dori question that we as designers, and when you're trying to, there's that conflict between your own identity and the identity that you have to subscribe to, and how you could turn it into a provocative artifact. So what do you say when one can, when, especially when Dori is questioning that, constantly we're questioning that identity and that aspect of what we are subscribing to, what Souvik was trying to say in the aspect of what we are learning and how we have to subscribe to something and then make under it.
Yeah, so I was very much interested in the things like critical design and speculative design, and how these things are not really about just function or solving a problem, right? But challenging what the precedents have been set in time in traditional design, right? And how these things roll out, which were very much reflected in how Dori talked about. These things are very much in line with white supremacy and these colonial ideas of design, and even in modernist context of how design is very much a thing of, say, a first world realm, which is very much mainly right, constricted to the affluent West and not really inclusive of all these other things. So even though I was realizing that this object or making something sits in critical design, it is still not, there was a dichotomy of conflict in my head, right? Because I was like, okay, this is a piece of critical design, but then what is critical design actually doing? Is it fighting for something? Is it actually being functional as the traditional problem solving does? Because there is a lot of confusion or this factual or like a faux borderline between actual problem solving and critical design, which says that critical design does something which actual problem solving does not do, which is very false, because even when you're doing traditional problem solving, you ask, how will this impact in the future? You ask those questions to yourself while you're designing, right? So there was this dichotomy. That's when I started challenging my idea of placing this or constructing something which was critical, right? Because as I said, that these things at the end are not being very inclusive, as I should not really say the words here, but Dori had in one of her talks used a Rihanna song to kind of put into context how funds are not being put into right directions, and it's very much critical and being very channeled into these first world problems of how these futures would look like. But where do these futures sit, and what is the constituents of these futures? Who are present in these futures, right? That's why there was a lot of debate going in my head as well, because in retrospect, my project really developed into something else and questioning something completely different, right? That's what happened.
Dori, would you like to talk about the way, or I would all like you could ask Vaishnavi and Srishti here, and I see that almost the similar trajectory with your students happening. Would you like, and they've already told the process, so is there anything that you would like to tell them, or Srishti or Vaishnavi, would you like to ask something about how the scripting project or the making for the Black Lives Matters worked? Dori, I would ask you to go first.
Yeah. Well, I'm a little bit spinning around the kind of question that Siddhi put in the chat around like what is the relationship between these artifacts that we make, right? Again, sort of work around like sort of critical thing, and then like the work of policy, and I think what we underestimate in some ways is like the power of the conversation. Like what I always talk about design, like design superpower, is its ability to take these ideas, like this ideal of democracy, this ideal of inclusion, this ideal of sustainability, and give it a form. And by giving it a form, it allows people to gather around it and to discuss, like, am I seeing the same thing you're seeing? No. Why am I seeing something different? Okay, what is the context around which I'm seeing something different? So again, if you think of like of racism and colorism and surface design, like if I see a pillow, right? And then again, it's a thing like, I love design because design can operate in stealth mode. So like if I'm coming into someone's environment and I pick up a pillow and I look at the pillow and I'm like, oh, what is this talking about? And then why is this here? And then all of a sudden, like the people who are also in this room, we can begin to have a conversation. And how we change, like if the way you change people's actions is by changing, and I say expanding their imaginations, right? Expanding their sense of possibilities. And so that object can be a trigger to engaging in a conversation that expands the possibilities for people. And then you sort of say, okay, what do I need to do from a policy perspective? Who do I need to bring into the room to allow this change, this new possibility, right? To inform and grow and share, and other people buy in, right, to this new possibility that wasn't possible until I went to sit down and have some tea and I saw this pillow and I noticed something and I was able to have a conversation with someone about it. Now, the challenging part, right, again, is like, at what point as a designer do you say, okay, I'm engaged in this process of just facilitating the conversation, and then you say, or am I the person who's writing the policy? Do I start moving into that space? Do I start moving into like the community facilitation and actioning space, right? And again, as designers, we have these amazing skills, right? To be able to do that, because even in the process of designing, right? Like we design for others, even if we're designing for ourselves, right? We design for others. So that means we're already engaged in a conversation, in a dialogue, in examining possibilities. So that skill is already there, and we just figure out what are the mechanisms by which we can bring more people, right? More people into that. And so again, I think objects are very powerful, but you have to follow the trail, right? You have to follow the trail of what are the other forms in which this conversation can grow, this discursive practice can grow and take new forms. Like policy is just writing stuff on paper. That's a new form. That is actually a design form, right? And so as a designer, what choices do you make around how far you want to follow the next iteration of the design form that this discursive possibility can take?
So Srishti or Vaishnavi, actually, those artifacts of creation and this feedback. So how do you see yourself looking at that type and where it moves to and how it influences, or how do you see that artifact become something that can influence the system? In fact, I would also like to call Induja and Anshika after this to talk on the fact that how that artifact became the provocation through an experience to become a reflection on what and how we are relating. Srishti.
So while doing my project, like the way it started out was really simple. It was just that to do the project, we were told to take one of the SDGs and kind of build a project around that. And like for the sake of, like for academic purposes, I just wanted to do typeface design. So I just decided to merge it together. There wasn't like great like thinking behind it or anything. And so when I created the survey and sent it out, I expected to just be like, all right, it's like, 50-50 masculine, feminine, or like 60-40 or something. I didn't expect there to be such a huge sort of difference in how people perceived typefaces. And it was really surprising to me. But if you think about it, it makes sense because like I found studies online that showed that humans like innately tend to associate rounder figures with femininity and sharper figures with masculinity, and that also translates into typeface design. And the one thing I was really struggling with after that is that if I bring this into question, like, am I perpetuating the stereotypes by bringing them up? And so I had a really hard time with that. In the end, for the sake of the project, what I decided to go forward with is to acknowledge that, people do see gender in typefaces, and to try and play with the stereotype. I mean, like, to try and play around with the stereotypes to create something completely unexpected. So, for example, what I found was like curvy shapes, curvy typefaces, thinner typefaces were feminine. So I decided to make a typeface which was pretty ambiguous, but looked quite feminine. And I also gave it a feminine name. So Rani, for Dori, it means queen in Hindi. And so that's how I decided to take forward the project. But I know that it can be done in so many different ways. And that was just something I really was struggling with.
But one of the things I really appreciate about like the way you described like your process and the way in which and the outcomes in and of itself is that again, it's like the breaking down of the different elements and then figuring out kind of like the right combination of them too. In many ways, I feel like you subverted, right, the categories, right? Because it's like, okay, it's it's kind of bold, so it feels strong, right? So it's bold and feels strong, but it's curvy, so it feels organic, right? And so I feel like because you did the analysis and you were very particular about the choices that you were making, that your outcome created something that, again, like redefines. Like if we say masculine is bold, but like no, but this is like curvy and bold. So it's like feminine can be strong, right? And so I think, and so I really appreciate it. I really appreciated the way in which actually the outcomes subverted what those stereotypes could be, right? Like they actually, and you were able to do that because you actually did such an in-depth analysis of the different sort of aspects of things, so that when you brought it together, as you said, it created that space of not I don't like ambiguity. It's like no possibility that feminine can be bold and strong, right? And again, like masculine can be curvy, and so there's this whole thing that you can begin to play with those elements to redefine, right? Like what feminine means and what masculine means, and because through typography, like we don't consciously think about it, then it's even more powerful in its ability to sort of shift our perspectives and open up possibilities, because we don't think of it doing that kind of work. Right?
We've actually almost run out of time, but I'm still going to ask Anshika, Induja, and Nalini, and their questions constantly on the chat, which Swagata has to still take up. Both Induja and Anshika, I'm asking that provocation, how do you think you can take it further for the impact part, a question that Dori puts forward to us as designers. And Nalini, with your identity, with the strong aspect of identity and the constant making that you built into it, how do you think it goes beyond a personal quest to, again, impact as a designer?
So our project revolves around nature and bringing people closer to nature and sensitizing them. It is basically about making invisible visible, because we are always around nature, but due to a hectic schedule, technology, or ignorance, we are somehow disconnected to it and do not understand or fail to understand the importance of it, are not able to, the benefits of it, we are not able to reap it. So through our, service design journey, which we kind of prototyped into our campus with our batchmates, we try to reconnect people through the experience that we designed, that we curated specially for them. And I think we were successful in doing that because of the positive reviews that we found. Yeah, that's, and if Induja has anything to add.
Yeah, so basically, just adding on to what Anshika said, our project was basically about, inclusivity above and beyond humans. So because as we, talk about it, we are not the only species that kind of inhabit Earth, we are forgetting that Earth is also like a planet that's home to, indigenous plants and animals, and they're around us. And with the rate in which we are going with respect to modernization and urbanization, we tend to overlook a lot of those factors. And it was also kind of based on a root cause analysis of the disconnect that was kind of becoming inherent. And that was the kind of provocation to kind of try and bring about an impact, or show the impact that nature has on humans, and how that coexisting aspect is kind of perhaps, at least for some people, a lot of people who are more into the urban humans, we are kind of overlooking it. So yeah.
And I just want to say this work is so important because, as I said, like decolonization is about the relationship we have to the land, right? And so a lot of the work that we have to do is about, in this case, where we've broken the connection, reestablish that connection. Again, reestablish that sense of principles. Like in the Anishinaabe which is one of the major indigenous groups here, right? Like, again, they talk about, and all my relations, right? And that means the water, that means the land, that means the air, that means the animals, that means that means all, and we are in direct kinship with all of those elements, right? And so all the affection that we might feel towards a beloved sibling or a beloved grandparent or whatever, we should feel to those elements of that live with us, right? And so almost any process of sort of decolonization, any process that you find, right, again, around justice, right, all normally is related to, you know, what's the relationship to the land? How do we recognize the indigenous relationship to the land, both in terms of like the people, but also what their attitudes and behaviors and regard and obligations were towards the land? Going back to Souvik's project in the beginning, right? Like, and so again, as designers, like, it is so important for us to, again, as part of our learning, as part of our training, right? Even understanding the materials that we use, that we are deeply, deeply connected to the land, right? It's a critical part of our practice as designers to be in relationship with all of our relations and design, not from a human-centered perspective, but from that perspective of how do my design decisions support all my relations? And that's where the innovation comes. Like, that's where the next wave of brilliance in design will come from, being able to figure out, how do I design this space so that even the smallest insect can find a home in the home that I'm building, right?
Dori, yes, ecological and non-anthropocene views. Yes, Nalini, you took a very interesting point of view, and I already asked you this. Would you want to respond on that?
Yes, when Dori talked about women creating for others, it really resonates with my own family history. So my grandmother studied textile, she studied fashion design, but then she only made garments for the family. She didn't make anything for herself. And these skills were passed down only to the women, and even my mother practices the same thing. She makes for others. She makes stuff. She makes garments for us, but then she never makes for herself. And also, these activities are confined to confined within the house, so it does occupy a public space. So I was thinking, how would it be to use these activities and go out in the public space where we are marginalized. So this was one angle I was interested in. And most of the stories that my mom talks about in terms of location, or any story that she talks about, there is a prominence of where it happened. So whether it happened inside the house, whether it happened within her Christian community, in the church. So these are some of the aspects I'm interested in looking at through the lens of these activities that are considered feminine.
If there's time. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dori.
I just wanted to say, like, one of the really important part of again reclaiming design is to reclaim it from this patriarchal sense of like genius master designers, right? And Nalini, in terms of the work and the intergenerational representation and challenging of spaces that you bring and bringing forth a community is such an important part of addressing that particular part of the work, the way in which this modernist project, right? The story of design is that it happens in a factory, right? That's what makes it important, is that it happens in the factory, that it's, again, it's often a very masculine space, that it's, and it's a thing where it's about the machine, right? It's not about necessarily the hand. So being able to sort of re-story the story of design that is about something that happens in the home, but again, that has issues as well. So what happens when you bring it to public space? Like, it's something that happens amongst women, and I'm hoping there's an intergenerational exchange that happens where it's like, okay, if your mom is making for everyone else, then are you making for your mom? So that she has that there's all these sort of processes of again, like restoring design so that the story of design can be resonant with who you are, right? But also resonant with other practices that exist outside of this modernist project that we talk about as what defines design.
Amrita, we move back to you. Nair, unless you want to say something or put it on the chat. And Vaishnavi also wanted to say, but we're really...
I have a question for Nalini. Can I go ahead?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I really liked your project. It's like a very interesting concept. And I'm more curious about, how did you come up with this concept? Was it an exploratory one, or you had this in mind and you kind of started with it? How did knitting come into place? I'm like really interested in the process of it.
So right before the pandemic started, I realized that I was diagnosed with PTSD, and I started to think about my trauma behavior, and I was trying to find ways to recognize these behaviors and try art therapy, or use these mindfulness techniques that people talk about. There is a community called Stitching Meditations, and people come together and they use stitching and mending as a way to heal themselves. Or so this was one of the main things I wanted to explore, and automatically my personal history also came into, like, I also wanted to talk about my personal history because it goes back generations. I realized that it is not only personal trauma that I'm dealing with, it is also transgenerational, and the politics of the community and how we were treated over the years has had a play in the way we have, in the way that the trauma has been passed down. I also see it as an inheritance, so of being a Dalit. And apart from objects that get passed down, families, you have jewels or land that gets passed on. For people like me who come from marginalized communities, trauma is also another thing that gets passed down. So this was the basic idea that I was that got me thinking of using these ways that women in my family used to heal themselves in a way. So my grandmother lost her mom at a very young age, and she studied at a missionary school. So they taught her knitting and crocheting and embroidery. So she sort of used this as a way to escape her very painful reality.
Leaves us with such a powerful emotion and self-reflection. Amrita, I think it goes back to you.
I'd just like to thank all of the speakers and panelists who were able to share their personal opinions and thoughts this way. We really appreciate the work that you've put in for participating with us. And I'd like to conclude this discussion by acknowledging that by virtue of consciously looking at the past and its consequential effect on the present, it has become imperative for us to together address the glaring oversights that have been facing us. It appears as though global themes in the field of design have had their own peculiar blind spots. I'd also like to leave the audience with a question here. How do we learn to perceive failures so as to better anticipate the impact of our choices? Along with that, the Lines of Sight team would also like to take this opportunity to remind everyone about the upcoming sessions of Points of View coming up tomorrow. Stay tuned for subsequent webinars addressing the curatorial tracks of insight and hindsight in the coming days from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. IST back here on Zoom as well as on YouTube. With that, we conclude today's session.
Amrita, I think Swagata was going to ask some 1 or 2 questions from the Q&A.
Oh, I apologize. I'd like to hand it over to Swagata in that case.
We're 10 minutes over the time, but I'll just quickly ask a question that a panelist or an attendee has asked. And before that, I want to really thank Amrita and thank you, Dori. Your presentation actually resonates with us. It is very similar to our historical narrative as well. And I congratulate each student to choose to inquire about questions which are rarely asked or are difficult to ask. Here's a question by Rucha Joshi, and it's addressed to Dori. She asks, how did you go about making space and managing the politics of hiring diverse professors when that would have meant making space or addition or, firing existing chairs? So how did you manage to create space for other professors when probably there was no space or there were addition?
So there's I would say there's 2 ways to approach this. But first of all is that in some cases we had retirements which actually created some of these opportunities. But there was actually a really important moment where the institution had to make a decision mostly about renewing contracts of faculty in order to create the space. And it was a very painful experience for the institution, but the way in which we entered the conversation was to talk about the fact that, again, that what we're trying to do is address, at this case, like for the Indigenous cluster hire, like 144 years of zero representation. For the Black cluster hire, it was 144 years of zero representation. And so this was the moment to create that space because, again, those previous 144 years that no one had created that space. So we sort of talked about why the time was now. The other thing we talked about is, again, as an institution, we said this is what our principles were. This is what we believed in. So the outcomes of following that principle is creating that space, which means, again, someone has to give up space. And if you understand, if you are aligned with decolonization, if you're aligned with diversity and inclusion, that means you have to give up space as your act, right? Like that is your act of supporting decolonization, because again, what colonization said is that, oh, this is mine, I'm going to take it, I'm entitled to this. And so the first act of decolonization is recognizing, well, actually, you're not entitled to this, right? but at the same time, you have to deal with people's pain. So in this case, in the case where, again, there was a lot of pain that we caused, like, again, listening to and being present in people's pain, so not trying to like ignore it. But I also said, what can I do to help you find another opportunity? So I was like, I will write letters of recommendation for you. I will open up my networks to help find and place you in other things so that you can continue to do the work. And again, with your sense of understanding, it just means though that the work that you do, you will not be done here for this moment now, because we've committed ourselves to this. And so it was painful. But in that sense of like, that everyone's okay with diversity, inclusion, decolonization if they don't have to give anything up.
That's true.
But the whole point of decolonization and diversity and inclusion is that you actually have to give up something precious, right? You have to give up that sense of entitlement to something, because that is actually the work. That is actually the work of decolonization, is saying, I'm not entitled to this. I cannot afford to build my good life on the despair, on the oppression of someone else. So in order to be the change, right, like I have to give up something. And then if you're not ready to do that, if you're not ready to make those kinds of sacrifices, then again, you're not aligned with the principles. And if you're not aligned with the principles, and we say as an institution, this is what our principles are about, then you're not aligned with the institution. And it is then your imperative in some ways to go, and again, we can help you find an institution that might be in greater alignment with where you are now, right? But you're no longer in alignment with that institution if you can't recognize that you actually have to give something up in order to make this happen.
Thank you, Dori. That leaves us with a very, very important message of how inclusivity begins with giving up some privilege. So thank you very much. There are some more questions, but since we have already run out of time and we are actually overboard by 15 minutes, please, if possible, kindly reply to email, which we'll send from our side with questions from some more participants. Thank you very much. Amrita, back to you.
Right. I just want to thank everybody once again for joining us today, the audience members, all of the people who sent in their beautiful questions that led to this conversation, and our panelists and our esteemed guest. With this, I would just like to remind everybody present here to attend tomorrow's session on Insight that will be hosted by my fellow curator, Reetika, Jathar, and our guest speaker would be Neelam Chaper. The session starts at the same time as today. So thank you once